This week, with the recovery of Officer Ron Gvili's remains, the 843-day ordeal of October 7th finally comes to a close. Every hostage has come home. But as phase one of Trump's plan for Gaza ends, something extraordinary is taking shape. The Board of Peace has launched, and it's unlike anything we've ever seen in modern international affairs. Trump basically is chairman for life with absolute veto power, a charter that never mentions Gaza but claims global scope. While Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar have signed on, America's traditional allies, Britain, France, Germany, have refused to participate. So, is this the future of conflict resolution? A fracturing of the international order? And most urgently for our listeners, what does it mean for Israel's security? Middle East scholar Dr. Mike Doran helps us break it down today. I'm Elana Mazel-Diamant, Executive Director of the Israel Law and Liberty Forum, and this is Basic Law. So today we're joined by Dr. Doran to help us understand what's actually happening here. He directs the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and he served as Senior Director on the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. All right, welcome, Mike. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Okay, so the first question, I'm just going to try to set the table, and then the rest of the show, I hope that you will bring us through your very careful analysis, and I'll get the chance to sort of stand back, ask a few questions, and hear you tell the story of how you see this from America, from the American perspective and from potentially the Israeli perspective. Now, we have this 20-point American plan for Gaza that was authorized and endorsed by the UN a few months ago, and there's a two-phase plan. The first one this week concludes with the return of Ron Gvili. There's a ceasefire, and all the hostages are now back in Israel. Phase two requires disarmament of Hamas, deployment of an international stabilization force, the establishment of Palestinian technocratic governance in the Strip, further IDF withdrawal, and then there's a plan for 1 to 2 decade reconstruction of Gaza, which we'll go into, and all of this is overseen by a Board of Peace. And then the last minute on my behalf here, and then I'd like to turn to you, is that the Board of Peace itself is a multi-part structure. It's got an executive board currently chaired by Donald Trump, and that oversees an executive board, which in turn supervises a high representative, and he's bridging to a 15-member committee, which is supposed to be running Gaza in the day-to-day, and that's mainly staffed by, potentially only staffed by Palestinians. And there are all sorts of questions about the membership of the group and how it's supposed to work. And now that I've said all of that, please simplify and tell me what is going on here. What? It's going to be very, very hard to edit out so much laughter. You're going to...
Well, no, why? You don't. Why do you don't have to edit it out?
That's true. I'm not going to. I was kidding. But tell me what this is. I don't understand what this is. I have literally 10 pages of questions that I've had a hard time narrowing down because I do not understand what this is, what it's supposed to do, and whether it's actually capable of doing it.
I suspect that the difficulty in grasping it comes from sitting down and building the org chart and looking at the Board of Peace and the Executive Board and the International Stabilization Force, and then all of the other 17 different bodies that are part of this thing, and it looks like a big Rube Goldberg operation, and you wonder how does this actually function? I think that's probably the wrong way to think about it.
Okay.
In terms of trying to understand it. Like starting with the org chart is I think it will just lead to confusion. I think it's easier if you just think of the different pressures that all the parties were under, and how they have created a bureaucratic structure to deal with the pressures. And that's rather abstract, but let's just start with practical problems that they have. The Israelis want to disarm Hamas, and so does so do the Americans. And so the first question is, who's going to actually go in and disarm Hamas? And the fact of the matter is, the Israelis don't want to do it. The Israeli military doesn't want to do it. I suspect that 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 Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want to do it, but I don't know. I'll be someday, maybe before I die, the documents will open up and people will describe the discussions that went on inside the Israeli government about what their options were in Gaza.
And at least released to the press that they authorized plans, three alternatives for the potential disarming of Hamas by the IDF if needed. Or one by agreement and two by the IDF if needed. Yeah.
They have always had plans to do it. And they released, one of the reasons they released the plans get released for many different reasons, but one of the reasons why Israelis talk about their plans to occupy Gaza is to put pressure on the Americans, Hamas, Israel's Arab partners, and so on, to do so, to find an alternative so that Israel doesn't have to do this. But the Israelis don't want to do it. Why do they not want to do it? For two simple reasons. One is, an Israeli disarmament of Hamas means leveling Gaza completely. And that's simply because Hamas has put tunnels under every building in Gaza, and it will have snipers on the top of every building. And when you fight that kind of war, the place gets leveled. That's nothing. That's just military reality. If you look at places like Raqqa, where the United States was fighting ISIS, if you look at any Syrian town after the civil war, this is what happens. It's nothing about, the Israelis want to level Gaza. It's just that if you're fighting this kind of enemy that hides behind the civilians, has tunnels, is on the top of buildings, it's going to be leveled. And the IDF, I think, makes a further calculation, which is, okay, we go in, we level the place, we get rid of Hamas, but then at some point we're going to pull back out. And then Hamas will just spring back like weeds after a summer rain. So we're at some point we have to manage this threat from a distance. So why don't we just start doing it now instead of going in and getting all of this international condemnation and having all this tension with the Americans as we level Gaza, and then we don't necessarily get the result that we want. So that's the picture the Israelis are looking at. The Americans are looking at the same picture, and they say, well, let's find an alternative way to disarm Hamas, and that leads us to the international stabilization force. So the idea is, well, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Azerbaijanis. I was very excited for a while. They seem to have dropped out, but
Yeah.
I was very excited about the Azerbaijanis being involved. And of course, the Turks volunteered. The Israelis didn't want that. But the problem here is that if you're an Arab country, imagine you're the Egyptians. The Egyptians would like to see Hamas severely weakened, if not eliminated. Let's say the Emiratis, even though there's no doubt, the Emiratis would like to see Hamas obliterated. But the Emiratis are not going to be the people that are going to put a gun pointed at the heads of Hamas fighters and say, drop your weapons or we'll kill you. And in fact, there is no force in the world except the Israelis that's going to do that. That's the number one problem. And there are several reasons for that. But just imagine this. Any Arab leader that puts a force in Gaza that is actually that would actually possibly have to fight with Hamas has to explain to their public and to the world why they're doing this. And under the current conditions, they would be accused immediately of being the mercenaries of Bibi Netanyahu, and that they would be the mercenaries of Smotrich and Ben Gvir. I'm talking about in Arab media. they need two things in order to put a force in there, even one that's going to be a rather benign force and just directing traffic. They need two things. They need a political authority under which they're operating, a political vision, number one, and number two, they need an international legal authority. And that then allows them to present what they're doing as a sort of service to the larger community, larger Arab community, Muslim community, international community, and they're not just the action arm of Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. So that is completely absent. Why? Well, the Israelis have said no two-state solution. No, the Saudi position all along has been that there has to be an irreversible pathway to a two-state solution, and they want the Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been clear: we're not going to have a Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza. The UN Security Council resolution under which the Board of Peace is being established stops short of saying two-state solution as well. So that's a problem for all the Arab participants.
It does
So
mention it aspirationally, but it ultimately ends up in a place where it talks about creating the pathway. But it does talk about
right,
one.
it does. That's the sop
Right.
to the Arabs. That's the nod to the need of the Arabs, but it stops short of what they wanted, because they wanted an irreversible pathway, and they didn't get it. And that was the Americans being deferential to the Israelis. And so I think it's an American position too. But if we just think about the United States negotiating between Arab partners on the one hand and Israel on the other, it's actually the legalities of this tilt in the direction of Israel. They tilt in the direction of Israel in two ways very clearly. One is that they did not uh, go for an irreversible pathway to a two-state solution. Number one, and number two, this thing is time limited, so that it basically expires with the Trump administration. Now it could be renewed. It could be renewed. So, but it's not. All of this is happening as part of a negotiation between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. And so the Board of Peace is. There's been a lot of talk lately. I'm sure you've seen all of the analysis saying that this is Trump's way to get a kind of alternative to the United Nations, something that's a bit more a bit more under the control of the Americans, because at the United Nations, anything the United States wants to do is subject to the Russian or Chinese veto, and it's cumbersome. The bureaucracy is at the United Nations is anti-American, anti-Israel. So he wanted a more flexible international umbrella for what he was doing, and he created this thing. And then I guess once they created it for Gaza, they started realizing, well, this could be actually useful in other areas as well. So the charter of the Board of Peace doesn't even mention Gaza.
Correct.
So, but it was created. The idea came out of Gaza and tried to solve all of these problems. And so I think it's a relatively useful thing.
Well, it not only does not mention Gaza, it basically explicitly says that it laments the inefficacy of the existing international system and that it's trying to do something else. So that comports pretty well with what you're saying. I have a ton of questions based on what you laid out here, because I could say that it sounds almost like whatever's happening there is theater that's driven by practical political needs as you see them.
I wouldn't say theater, because theater. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, do it.
I wouldn't say theater, because theater suggests that it's smoke and mirrors,
Okay.
and I would say it's somewhere between theater and whatever the opposite of theater is. There are practical. These all of these structures are serving. They're there for a reason. They're not there to for administrative efficiency, that's for sure. But they're there for political reasons.
Okay. And just so I understand, this is like a top level question before I move forward. I think it would be good to set up in just 1 to 2 minutes. Why is disarming Hamas such an international priority beyond, let's say, Egypt and Israel? And when we talk about disarming Hamas, are we also talking about disarming PAJ and any number of other terror organizations in the Strip, or are we just focused there?
Huh. I assume that we're talking about Pidge as well as Hamas, but your question made me realize that I've never heard anyone mention Pidge. But that has to be bound up with the disarming of Hamas. I can't imagine that we want. Pidge is a wholly owned subsidiary of the IRGC. I can't believe that we would want to have a Iranian proxy running around with weapons, killing people in Gaza. But now that you mention it, I mean, I kind of forgot about Pitch in all of these discussions. Um, but my number one question, I'll answer your question directly about why we all want that. But my number one question is anyone actually going to do it? Because I'm trusting President Trump when he said recently that within 3 months Hamas is going to be disarmed, and I'm trusting him, but I'm with the attitude of trust but verify. I'm waiting to see it. So I'm not saying this is never going to happen, but this is the number one challenge. If Hamas is not disarmed, then none of the dreams of Gaza Lago and Dubai on the Mediterranean, none of them are going to come true. I don't think any of those are going to come true anyway. But we're not going to have any kind of rebuilding of Gaza and improvement of the situation until Hamas is disarmed. And the thing that is missing in all of this up to now is the force that is actually going to take Hamas's guns away from it. And nobody wants to do that. And we're kind of hoping that pressure, political pressure it will at some point lead Hamas to just lay down their arms and leave. But I'm not betting on that. I want to see the force that's going to go in and make it happen.
Okay.
Now, you asked, why does everyone want this? The Palestinian-Israeli conflict in general is at the center of so many ideological movements in the world, whether it's global progressivism, Arab nationalism, Islamism, and so as a practical strategic matter, Hamas is not that important to anyone other than the Israelis, the Egyptians, and the Americans. Yeah, maybe a few other people, Palestinians, of course. But in terms of politics, global politics, and even domestic politics in a lot of countries, it's right at the center of everything.
There's a bunch of questions that I'd like to turn back to, maybe even from the Israeli perspective, as you see it, kind of at arm's length. But there is this $112 billion reconstruction plan that's been introduced by Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff for, as you called it, Gaza Lago. And it's supposed to be a decade or 2 decades in, and the U.S. is supposed to be putting up a significant amount of money toward it. I think something like $60 billion. That too, is that something that, as you see it, a genuine aspiration, something that's really driving things here, or is that kind of extra tapestry? If
It's a great question, and the simple answer is that I don't know. I don't know how deeply they actually believe that they can pull this whole thing off, but I think they are consciously presenting an alternative to all of the other frameworks that people put around Gaza. So if I have to choose between Gaza Lago and irreversible pathway to a two-state solution under the Palestinian Authority, I'll choose Gaza Lago. Whether how close Gaza Lago will come to actually producing the rosier pictures that they are presenting, I don't know. Look, I mentioned before, I want to see what's the force that's actually going to go
Right.
in and disarm Hamas. Another thing I want to find out is who who's the first bank that's going to go in and establish a bank in Gaza. There are no banks in Gaza. There are no banks in Gaza. And I'm not I'm not exaggerating for effect when I say there are no banks in Gaza. There are no banks in Gaza. So how do you, if you're going to build businesses there and have tourism and people are going to come and invest money, you need banks. So how are we even gonna build a basic banking structure there? And of course, you can't do that until you disarm Hamas. So, uh, if I had to bet what Gaza is gonna look like, um, on the day that Donald Trump leaves office, and that at that point, the board of peace and everything else um, uh, becomes a dead letter. I I would guess it's gonna look a lot like what it looks like today. Uh, but it might be it might in terms of physical infrastructure and everything. That's my bet. That's what I can think is probably the most likely scenario. However, there is this factor which and I don't and this goes right to the heart of your question. I don't know how much weight to put on it. Donald Trump is invested in this. Donald Trump has a lot of power and a lot of influence, and he's pushing together with, and through Witkoff and Kushner, and that is moving things along. The situation this week is not the same as it was a month ago, and the situation a month ago is not the same as it was a month before that. So, maybe I'll end up being very, very pleasantly surprised at the end of the Trump term. The situation is more dynamic than I probably would have expected a year ago, and that's interesting, and it needs to be watched. But I'm disinclined to believe any big project that anyone has to turn the Middle East into something very different than what I have come to recognize.
So let me ask you two questions here from a very narrow, self-interested Israeli perspective. Okay. Um, and we'll start with just the fact that Qatar and Turkey seem to be highly involved here. Qatar, of course, hosts Hamas leadership. We bombed Doha, I think, barely a year ago. Um, Turkey, Erdogan vocally supports Hamas. Uh, we're not very happy. The Israeli public is not very happy that these actors are involved to the point where the Israeli right-wing parties have wanted Netanyahu to have nothing to do with this. Netanyahu, of course, signed on for what seemed to be like inevitable political reasons. Perhaps you have more insight into that. But is the Israeli public right in seeing this as a kind of failure? Is there a sunny side to it that we're uh, missing? And what are the dangers?
The Israeli right wing um, fear fixation, I would even say, on Turkey and Hamas is both justified and um, and ill considered at the same time. That's how I would put it. I mean, think about it this way. I just heard Minister Shikley's talk at the anti-Semitism
Mm-hmm. Congress.
conference. He's against anti-Semitism, by the way.
We all were.
Was it?
It was a
Yeah,
unanimous vote.
yeah, they were all against it. But he sounded alarm against Turkey and Qatar, and we're possibly right now on the eve of a war an Israeli-American war against Iran. That's the the number one political goal of the Trump Netanyahu coalition right now is, after Iran, the next goal is, of course, disarming Hamas. So why are Israeli ministers making their top line message about Turkey and Qatar at this moment? What purpose does that serve? Who are they talking to? And who are they talking to with that message? And what are they proposing as the alternative? And I think the only answer I have to that question is they're talking to Israeli domestic audiences in an election year, and they have no alternative whatsoever. And they're not aware of or not thinking about what their message to the United States is. Because ultimately, from my point of view, this is a negotiation between the Israelis and the Trump administration about what the international coalition around Gaza and around the new Middle Eastern order should look like. So if you're going to say to the Americans, you shouldn't be working with the Turks and the Qataris, what is the alternative American order that they want? Can you build an American order on the United States, Israel, an American order in the Middle East on Israel, Greece, India, and the UAE? I hope that the answer to that question is no, you can't, because you can't. Let me point out another thing about this that bothers me. I just wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal last week, pointing out that all of Iran's foreign currency dealings are run through Dubai. Dubai is the economic lung of Iran.
Okay.
Now, I have tested this, and I say to pro-Israel audiences, what American ally is doing the most to help Iran evade American sanctions and sell oil to China? And of course, they all say Qatar. Oh, and then number two, Turkey, right? It's the UAE. But everyone loves the UAE because the Israelis and pro-Israelis love the UAE because they're in the Abraham Accords and they're against Islamism, and they cooperate with Israel regionally in places like Somaliland and so on, or at least support them. All well and good, but the Middle East is a complex place, and the number one enemy of Israel in the Middle East today is still Iran. And the country that is doing the most to help Iran evade American sanctions and sell oil to China is the UAE. So why are Israeli ministers saying Qatar, Turkey, Qatar, Turkey, Qatar, Turkey? Which is not to say that there isn't serious issues between Israel on the one hand and Qatar and Turkey on the other. But I think Israelis need to think through, what is it that they want to demand of the United States about Turkey and Qatar? What practically, because there is no American order in the Middle East without Turkey. There is no American order without Turkey.
Let me just add one. In general, when I interview someone, I don't want to inject my opinions, but I'll add one little layer of analysis. No, just the analysis. On the question of why ministers would be speaking that way, outside of the fact that Israelis do have dealings with Qatar, but it's quite in the news now because of Qatar Gate and its influence. Its rather insidious and terrible influence in the West is also known. And Turkey, as you know, there's a very long and complex history of conflict. When we talk about why are ministers saying X or Y or Z, this is Israel, it's not the States. So they're not 100%, and certainly in the Likud, which is a party which is democratic, and so they're constantly kind of ready for primaries where people have to compete within the party for spots, which is not the case in many of the other parties in the Israeli political system. So what you end up having is people that are trying to speak to their specific base within the parties.
Yeah.
And, the way that the decisions are made as to who becomes minister of a given issue is very much about sort of political convenience. And that's fine because there are plenty of countries where you have ministers that are not necessarily subject experts in the areas that they run. But, the Minister of Tourism or the Minister of Diaspora Affairs is not actually, that's not his gig. His gig is to run in Israeli politics and to get to the most senior levels possible. And it's really only at the most senior levels, slash almost only at the level of the prime minister where you're actually running the country.
I understand that, and that's why I said that when I look at this and I say, why are they talking like this? My only answer is that it's really domestic Israeli politics rather than foreign policy.
Right. It's not, their job is not. My point is, there's basically only one person in Israel whose job is foreign policy, except for perhaps at this point Gidon Sar, and that's Bibi.
But this this puts an enormous amount of political pressure on him to and I think, look,
Yep,
the
that's the
Turks
point.
hear all this. The Turks hear all this, and in my view, the thing that we should all want right now, the number one thing that we should all want right now is to eliminate the Iranian nuclear program and to eliminate the Iranian ballistic missile program and to eliminate the Iranian support for proxies around the region. That's our first set of goals. The second major goal that we should have is to prevent a Turkish-Israeli war, which is a realistic possibility, and we should prevent it. So everyone should be thinking very carefully about how to prevent that, and we should be choosing our words carefully that will help us to prevent that. And I am concerned. I am concerned when I hear people talking like this because you can't make a simple distinction between Israeli domestic politics and Israeli foreign policy, because the pro-Israel community in Washington and Israelis at all levels on the street and up into the prime minister's office are beginning to talk this way, and it has implications, has real world implications that we need to think long and hard about.
So what I was going to say is that there are a couple of more questions I'd like to ask about the Board of Peace. However, you have opened up this really interesting line of discussion, and I just want to follow it through with one more follow-up.
I just want to can I just say to everyone that I am aware that there's a bright sunlight on the right side of my face, and there's nothing I can do about it.
No, I know. It's you are a saint. You are.
Yeah. There's actually no sun out there. It's just it's actually coming.
The halo's a little cockeyed.
So yeah.
All right. So just really one question about this, and I want to circle back to the Board of Peace, which is, I think, at least within the right, a lot of people see that war as an inevitability, and they believe. One second, I just want to understand from you why you don't. So they believe that despite that basically Turkey is at this point overtaken by a culture which is indisposed toward us permanently. That's the general gist. So why do you see it differently? What do you think can be done when you outside of watching?
Why do I say it? I think that no one with any country ever should work on the assumption that war is inevitable. I think that is look at what we're talking about here. Turkey is the second largest army in NATO. So very serious power, much more serious than Iran. And it has never fired a drone at Israel. It's never fired a missile at Israel. Yes, President Erdogan has openly looked forward to the destruction of Israel and has talked about, aspired to liberating Jerusalem and so on. And these are not things that should be taken lightly at all. I'm not suggesting that. It's a threat, it's a challenge, and it's one that should be taken seriously. Um, but um, but we're a long way from turning that rhetoric into actual strategies that's going to lead to conflict.
But doesn't
And
that
I
at
think
least
that
justify not wanting their troops involved?
100%,
Okay.
100%, 100%. I don't. I think um, I would agree with the Israelis. I think that the Kushner Witkoff. I suspect the president himself has an insufficient grasp on the depth of the conflict between the Turks and the Israelis, or the depth of the chasm between them, and that this is a very dangerous thing. Not a, and I think there's a tendency. I glean. I'm not in contact with Witkoff, Kushner, and the president, so I uh, I can't say that I really talked it through with them, but I listen very carefully to how they talk, and I listen to people who talk to them, and I think that they suffer from a very American um, assumption about the world, which is that money can alleviate all conflict. The money is really what drives politics and history, and that we can, if we structure the economic incentives correctly, we can make all of these other conflicts go away. It's really quite striking to me that in June, after America bombed the nuclear sites in Iran, and after the Israeli war against Iran, one of the first things that Steve Witkoff did is he came out and called on Iran to join the prosperity machine that is the American Arab alliance in the Gulf, and let's come, let's go, let's all go make money together. Um, I don't think that that's mere rhetoric. I think that that reflects something of a worldview that they have. They don't understand that their job is to keep Israel and Turkey apart, and to bring Turkey into Gaza, which is right on Israel's border, Israel's most neuralgic point, and a point that's very distant from Turkey's borders, is unwise. It's completely unwise. And then it is also, as I mentioned before, it's the centerpiece of, ideologically, it is
Yeah.
the ideological center of all of the conflicts in the region. It's very clear that President Erdogan sees himself as the leader of the Muslim world. And as such, he wants to be the defender of the Gazans against the Israelis. He's increasingly depicting Israel as the cause of all of Turkey's problems and America's problems in the region. And the United States should not facilitate him in presenting himself in that way. It's not in the American interest, not in the Israeli interest. So I agree with the Israelis on that. But what there needs to be is a set of very, very practical, a set of very, very practical pieces of advice to Washington about how to deal with the Turks. A picture of Turkish-Israeli accommodation. I'm not talking about kumbaya, but just how the two can live together. And public messaging has to has to be in support of that. Public messaging that says we're in an inevitable conflict with this country because it's under the grip of Islamism doesn't help Israel in any way. It doesn't deter the Turks. It doesn't advise the Americans on what practically to do, and it doesn't prepare the Israeli public for the very difficult decisions that have to be made in this arena.
Okay. Let's move on to our final two questions. Um, you stressed repeatedly in this conversation that the Americans effectively insisted that there would be a pathway to a Palestinian state, meaning it's not an inevitability, but that the Arab world really wanted it, and that I think you said the legalities here are in favor of the American/Israeli position. Um, this National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, which is going to be administering it day to day, if I were a suspicious person, I might say it looks to be setting the groundwork in a very real way. And this is a committee that's already convened. Um, it is chaired by Dr. Ali Shath, a former PA deputy minister from a Gaza clan with deep Fatah ties. And there's a veteran of PA intelligence and a lifelong Fatah member. And the economy minister previously directed the Palestine Islamic Bank, which is supposed to have facilitated Hamas affiliated transactions among all of its others, and so on. So, what is this committee, and uh, is there a less suspicious reading that one can take, or am I right?
No, one should be suspicious. The thing that I personally am most suspicious about at this stage is not sneaking the PA in through the back door, although there are a lot of
Front
people who
door.
want to do
It's
that.
pretty front.
Oh yeah, but slipping it through the front door, whatever.
Yeah.
The I'm concerned about Hamas remaining
Mm-hmm.
because what clearly what Hamas is thinking about right now is rebranding itself as, let's say, Gaza Police Force, and that I think that's the thing, um, that's the near term problem. I think really more bigger than the PA is Hamas. Um, I don't know if you followed what the games the Americans played with the PKK in northeast Syria. There's the Kurdish group. Well, the PKK itself created its Syrian arm and called it the YPG, and pretended, which allowed the Americans to pretend when they allied with the YPG against ISIS that they were not aligning with the PKK. And then but then there were so many American authoritative public intelligence documents that said the YPG is the PKK that it was a little bit embarrassing for the Americans to ally with the YPG. So what they did is they rebranded it as the Syrian Democratic Forces, and it was the YPG. And so if Hamas is clever, it will try a similar maneuver. And you could imagine people in the American system, without naming any names, I don't want to impute intentions to anyone without actually knowing what those intentions are. But there are always people in the American system who are very desirous of propagandizing the American people about who the Americans are dealing with. Let's put it that way. So there would be a lot of, and there'd certainly be Europeans and Palestinians and Arabs who would want to facilitate this transformation of Hamas into something else, or at least, giving it a makeover. So I'm worried about the makeover, and less worried about the PA question that you raised.
Well, why are you less worried about it? Meaning, is it? How do you see that committee?
Well, if there's who's going to rule Gaza? I mean, if Israel has made a decision, and it doesn't want that for political domestic Israeli political reasons, nobody running Israel, whether on the political from the political echelon or from the security establishment, wants to come out before the Israeli people and say, "We have decided we don't want to rule Gaza." They don't want to say that. So once you but once that decision has been made, and that decision has been made, once it has been made, then somebody's got to do the job, and you don't have Zionists there in Gaza, so it's gonna be people who don't like Israel who are going to be in charge of the Palestinians, and then the question is, how do you ensure that they don't represent a security threat to Israel like the one that was posed on October 7th or anything near that? And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's red lines, Hamas has to be disarmed. First of all, return all the hostage. He got those. That's great. We didn't think that was going to happen. I would have, if you'd asked me a year ago, would this happen? I would have said no. That's one of the things that makes me a little bit cautious about being pessimistic about how all this is going to unfold, because I see that the Trump Netanyahu alliance has already produced results that I didn't expect to see. So let's start from that. But Prime Minister Netanyahu is very, very good at finding the minimum that he needs in order to get the maximum amount of leverage over Gaza without having to go in and rule a bunch of Palestinians who don't want to be ruled by Jews. So we want disarmament of Hamas and demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, and an end to Hamas's political rule in Gaza. And he's also said no two-state solution with the Palestinian Authority. So, if they sneak guys in there who are basically run by the PA, but it hasn't been legitimated in either in the political horizon for Gaza or in the by international law, I can live with that.
I mean, you were the one that just, whatever number of minutes ago it was, said that when President Trump's term ends, the Word of Peace is basically a dead letter, and obviously key parts of the UN Security Council have not joined up, so that may be the case. But if it's a dead letter and the structure stays, right, and let's not forget that the PA today still supports terror, right?
Right.
I don't. I'm asking genuinely from a curious perspective, because I trust your judgment on most things, but I don't quite understand how that works.
Well, it's the least worst option. It's not that. Is it the best option? No, it's not. But the like I say, the Israelis have already said, and they haven't said. The Israelis have already decided that they don't want to rule Gaza. But another red line the Prime Minister has insisted on is that Israel has overall responsibility for the security of Gaza.
Right.
That's a huge one. And I think that protects Israeli interests. Where I do see a threat going forward, it was the one that you alluded to. What we're looking at, let's be honest, is the internationalization of Gaza. And Israel always opposed the internationalization of Gaza, and now here we have it. And it's the form it's taking under Donald Trump is relatively benign. Trump is enough predisposed toward Israeli interests and sees Gaza enough, in the same way, or defines the American interest as congruent with the Israeli interest, that it's not that much of a threat. But if we had if we had a Kamala Harris administration, she's going to take the international structures in whatever form she inherits them, and she's going to turn it in a direction that's going to create more conflict with Israel, because she's going to pump up, like what you're saying. She will certainly pump up. She'll grab hold of these little bits of the Palestinian Authority that are embedded in the Board of Peace vision for Gaza, and she's going to try to pull them together with the PA. Absolutely, and that's the next conflict to come. So what you want to do is you want to maximize the time you have with Donald Trump here in the areas of agreement to get the best result you can get in the time that you have, which means, and the best result you can get is absolute destruction of Hamas. That should be the near term goal.
All right.
And
Well,
don't get don't get too captivated by Gaza Lago. The beauty of Gaza Lago is that it creates a political vision under which you can destroy Hamas potentially.
here. Okay. So I have a feeling that I will be consulting you about this again. I hope that you join us again. I truly appreciate the conversation. Um, and as always, really a delight.
Thank you.